Yawai fellas, g'day everyone online. Welcome to Kinaway's Cybersecurity info session with Aon chaps, Chris and Michael. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us today and to try and educate our businesses that we're supporting in our business community around cybersecurity and all the didgeridon'ts, all the things that we need to know and we shouldn't. So we've got some. First and foremost, my name's Jimmy Kyle. For everyone watching online, I'm a proud Thungari man and very proud to work for Kinaway Aboriginal Business Chamber of Commerce. And I'd like to acknowledge today that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I extend my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also to all the other lands on which our viewers might be tuning in from. I extend our respects on behalf of Kinaway to the traditional owners there. Chaps, would you like to introduce yourselves and for our viewers, give them a little insight into Aon and what you're all about?
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Jimmy. So quick introduction of myself and my company. So I'm Michael Parrant. I'm the cyber practice leader here in Australia, for Aon Australia. Just for those who don't know what Aon is, they're an insurance brokerage or an intermediary between your risk insurance requirements and the providers of those insurance solutions. So we're your trusted advisors when it comes to providing risk advice. Myself, I've been doing cyber insurance and cyber risk now for the last 10 plus 15 odd years. Been doing that for Aon, both here in Australia as well as in the UK. Spent some time in the UK where I learned cyber in a fair bit more detail and came back to Australia in 2016 to lead the charge for cyber insurance and risk here in Australia. I'll let Chris do some introductions of himself.
Yeah, Chris McLaughlin. I work for a law firm called Clyde & Co. And we effectively, one of our areas of specialization is cyber incident management. And we deal with about 500 incidents a year from all sizes of organizations and across all industries. And so my experience is I run the cyber advisory practice across Asia Pacific. Been doing cyber for about 30 years. So not much I've not seen over the last period of time, and sort of really looking forward to provide sort of some of the insights and learnings that both myself and Mick have gained in this industry and this sector over the last few years. So I think I might just start with a little bit of ground setting around what we're seeing in terms of the sort of cyber threat landscape and the types of threats that we see emerging across all industries and sectors in Australia. So, hopefully everybody's heard of ransomware. Everybody's heard of the damage it can cause once an attacker's on your systems and they encrypt your systems and data and you can't operate. So that's still one of the biggest threats to most organizations, because what they're doing is they're trying to extort money from you, and criminals, that's their aim, is to steal money. And it's the most effective way to do it at the moment. Second to that, we probably see what we call business email compromise or invoice redirection. So if you're working in an industry, say construction, manufacturing, that you've got a big supply chain, lots of suppliers and partners, criminals are really interested in you, because if they can get into your email systems, they can compromise your payment processes, and they can identify invoices that you're paying. They can redirect those funds and they can steal the money that way. So those are probably two of the key areas that we see at the moment. And Australia is a big target. It's a big target for cyber criminals. It's seen as an easy target. And it's not just about attacking organizations and industry, but it's also attacking individuals.
Can I ask, why is it seen as an easy target?
I think there's a couple of reasons to that. I think Australia is actually seen as a country who hasn't made a lot of investment in cybersecurity. And I think if you keep ahead of the press with Claire O'Neill, the new Minister for Cyber, if you see what we're trying to do as a country, being cyber secure by 2030, I think there's been a realization across industry and across government that we haven't had the investment. And the other reason is Australia is a relatively early adopter of technology, and that's just basically because of the geography that we're in. We've had to rely on technology for communication and for transport and for everything that we do. And so we've got these vast interconnected networks that are very complex, and a population who uses technology, sort of more than a lot of other developed nations. I don't
Well,
think.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add to that is the security adoption hasn't necessarily been kept in tandem with the IT adoption, which again, for all intents and purposes, it's facilitated the growth and the economy that we've got here in Australia, but security hasn't, for whatever particular reason, kept pace. And unfortunately, a quote that I remember reading in a book for quite some time ago, the book says, where's the effect of the earlier adopters of technology are always criminals because they can see the profit in it. And that was a quote from some 200 odd years ago. And again, it still rings true today. So I think criminals will always look to monetize the easy option. And unfortunately, security here in Australia hasn't quite kept pace, and they see that as an opportunity.
Well, that probably leads us into our first question. And I've been chatting with our businesses in our business community around some of their concerns. Now, I'm certainly not an IT expert, so these are going to be very common man type of questions. So maybe you can educate us in the process. But a really simple one is, what are the best options for cybersecurity?
Yeah, look, I think it depends on your organization and technology that you've adopted. So, Jeremy, we were discussing earlier around, if you're using Microsoft and your emails, Microsoft, Office 365, and you're using all of those tools that come with that product suite, then obviously using any of the native tools that come along with the suite are much easier to deploy and probably going to be the cheapest option for you. If you've got a more complex environment that you need different tools and technologies, to be honest with them, most of them are much of a muchness. There's not much difference in them apart from price. So, it's got to be the best fit for purpose tool that's going to help you manage and mitigate the risk, and that it's going to be scalable for your business. One of the things that I've learned over the years is a lot of people are very quick and eager to go buy the latest technology. And most of the analysts agree that, you end up only using maybe 20 or 30% of the capability of that tooling before you actually go buy the next tool to fill the gap. So it's actually, whatever you buy, sweat it, maximize it, use it to its maximum potential so that you don't end up with, overinflated costs to put in overlapping technologies.
Brilliant. Can I ask, what would what are the necessities? What are the dummies guides necessities? What are the very fundamental basics that people need?
Well, I might maybe start from what we're seeing from the insurers, so the partners that we work with in order to provide insurance coverage. And I'll stipulate that cyber insurers are not security experts, but they've certainly been learning a fair bit over the last 3 or 4, 5 or so years now, since cyber insurance itself has become quite challenging. I might then hand to you, Chris, to add some extra colour to that. But what I can say over the last 3 years has become a ubiquitous requirement of organisations is MFA, or multi-factor authentication, which is basically a second access point to a change. So you're implementing a change, whatever that might be. There's a secondary method of communication to say, is this a legitimate communication? Is this a legitimate request? So that multi-factor authentication, if I go back 2-3 years, it became the first question that insurers asked: do you have MFA? Right. And that evolved to being, well, tell me more about your use of MFA. It became a requirement on 3 or 4 different things within the organisation. And just on that MFA thing, that's not a new concept. It is being adopted to technology much more now, but it's something that's existed within business for many, many years. Certainly anyone who's within, say, the payments industry or payment requirements, if you used to get a bank request detail, it was good protocol to say, is this a legitimate communication? Or even, am I authorized to make this change? Do I need a secondary person within the business to agree this change? So adopting that simple method, translating that to this insurance world and translating it to the IT world became critical. So MFA is certainly the thing. If you're not looking at that from a policy procedure perspective, that should be item number 1. I'd say then from a less of a technical perspective, but maybe a policy perspective, would be patch management, which is the systems you're using. They are often need to be patched in order to make sure that any holes in that system has been resolved. Having a really good patch management policy in place is, I think, becoming a critically important thing for insurers. They want to hear that when a new patch is released, that someone is authorizing that quickly, or at least testing it quickly to make sure it's not going to cause more harm than the perceived fix is being deployed. Those are the two things I'd say the most important. One is a relatively important technological implementation. Another is, say, a policy implementation, which has some technical components to it. Maybe the third and final thing I'll mention, which is, again, really important for insurers, is privileged account management, which is within your business. Some people have higher privileges than others from a changing the network's perspective or agreeing those sorts of changes. Having a privileged access management program is really, really important for insurers. They want to understand that people who are authorized and have higher privileges within the business are not necessarily easily compromised by criminal groups when they try to gain access to an organization. So those are the three things I'll cover. We could talk about that for extra items for hours, but I'll maybe hand to Chris just to add some extra content there from an actual security perspective.
Yeah, I think when we talk about, it's got to be complete end-to-end people, process, and technology. And what we tend to use is international better practice frameworks to align ourselves with good practice. So probably one of the most widespread frameworks in Australia used by most organizations is the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So NIST is the US National Institute of Science and Technology, who puts out better practices for all technology within the US federal system. And so really, best practices we look at: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So identify is around knowing your assets, knowing the risk to those assets, and making sure that you've got appropriate remediation and governance in place. Obviously protect is the technologies that you're putting in place to protect your data and systems and people. Then, sort of again, same with the preventive technology, like what you're doing to prevent access into your systems. And then, respond and recover. So the detect, respond, recover are probably the three most important areas. So, every organization is vulnerable. There's no such thing as perfect security. But being able to detect when a threat actor is in your environment and understand what they're doing is critically important to respond and recover from the event. And then obviously the response and the recovery. So what do you do? What are your incident response plans and processes? Who are your partners and your vendors that are going to come and help you? And then the recovery from the incident is critically important because, we know that suffering a significant cyber incident isn't we've done it, we've recovered, and we move on. There's sometimes an impact of 3, 4, 5 years after the event that the organization still suffers. They suffer in terms of, and we were talking to a number of people. We had a summit last week. We talked about this, and one of the chief executives who was talking about an incident was actually saying that one of the things we don't realize is mental health among staff when there's a critical incident that's highly publicized. It puts a lot of pressure on them, and it's a very difficult thing to manage and recover from. So cyber is not really a victimless crime. It's not just something that impacts individuals, but it's definitely something that impacts the psyche of the organization. So, having that end-to-end process, those controls in place that do cover your people, process, and technology is critically important, not just for your business, but for your people as well.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to, for our listeners, our viewers online, just go back to those three main points, of course, which is the multi-factor authentication, the patch management, and the what was the third one? The primary, the privileged account manager management. So yeah, those three in particular, I think, really lock in that very basic start to the process, and then, as you mentioned, Chris, going on to think about what are the business's processes, what are the more bigger long-term processes. This brings us to our third question, and one of the businesses asked me, do we need cloud protection?
Yeah, easy answer, absolutely.
Right.
Organizations are moving at pace to adopt cloud services, and you've got to be very clear what you're getting from your cloud service provider and what you're expected to do yourself. So any contract within a cloud agreement will have the concept of shared responsibility. It won't be you give us all of your data, you give us all of your sort of IT processing, and then we'll just do it for you and you don't have to worry. That's not the case. You have to consider things like identity and access management. As you mentioned, Jimmy, with the privileged access management, any administrator that's managing your cloud services, making sure that those accounts are secured. Because if they're not and somebody can access your on-premise, so non-cloud environments, can easily get access into your cloud environments. And if you've not got the basic protections in there, then they've got the keys to your kingdom. So you really need to consider what you're signing up to and with your cloud provider and what your responsibilities are and what their responsibilities are. And a good rule of thumb really is to think of you've got to consider that whatever's in the cloud, you should be treated as is in your own environment, and it should be protected the same way. You can't delegate accountability for the protection of your data just because it's in the cloud.
Gotcha. I think I know the answer to this one now, but I'm going to ask you another silly question. Do we need Wi-Fi protection?
I would say absolutely. Wi-Fi protection, say whatever that might be. But for instance, I'm connected into the network today, but I'm using a VPN in order to gain protection. So there's a multi-layered approach to security when we talk accessing anything. And Wi-Fi is absolutely one of those. Chris and I could probably scare people with just how easy it is for someone to spoof a Wi-Fi address, make it look legitimate. Let's say you walk into a McDonald's and you're used to connecting to the Wi-Fi McDonald's Wi-Fi. It would be easy for us to replace that Wi-Fi, that McDonald's Wi-Fi, with an illegitimate Wi-Fi access. And we could, within pretty short order, gain access to people's private information, including their banking details, if they were smart enough or maybe not smart enough to access their banking details on the McDonald's Wi-Fi network. The same principle applies to you using and making available to others your Wi-Fi, as I have used today. I think it's really important to make sure that any access point into your network is protected. And indeed, if you're not accessing that, then someone could take advantage. And it's all about protecting your domains.
Yeah, and we know criminals will actually target places near corporate offices. So they'll target like coffee shops that they know people will be going having business meetings. We know that they target airport lounges. We know that they target hotels, and so if your people are out doing business around the country and they're accessing your corporate systems, as Mike says, absolutely put a VPN on so that communication back into your corporate network is protected. And what we call it sniffing. We call it sniffing the network. Like they're trying to find the credentials so that they can then take those in at a later time, sort of actually attack your organization. But I think if we broaden out the question of Wi-Fi and the question of access, we've also got to think about, the ports that you have in your office that you plug laptops into, making sure that those are protected as well. Because what we see is, sort of criminal organizations aren't adverse to trying engineering their way into an office and plugging in a laptop into an open port. And if those aren't closed down and protected, then those criminals can actually access systems and services across your network. So I think you've got to think broader about access and about access into your systems and networks. And I think one of the other things that we've seen over time is a lot of manufacturing sites will put up Wi-Fi in their facilities that aren't protected because they might be in a remote location and everybody thinks, hey, like nobody's going to be around, so it doesn't really matter. But, people do drive past these facilities and they do try to sniff the credentials and they try to find the anything that they can use to subvert or gain access into manufacturing systems, which otherwise may be segregated from a network, but maybe you might be able to jump through Wi-Fi.
And we should probably just also make it clear that the criminals have automated most of these tools. It's very easy for them to find these vulnerabilities. It's not as if they need to go and hunt for it. They can find it automatically just by driving up and down the street. So it's quite, for them, cost effective to find these holes. For us, the impetus is to make sure that we're closing down those holes wherever we can.
So can clicking, this brings us, I guess, to a slightly different question. Can clicking on an unknown attachment change your settings or give criminals access? Can it give access to others?
Yeah, absolutely. Clicking on links will activate some malware code that will then implant it on the machine, which will allow a number of things to happen. So it could release ransomware, which obviously is going to encrypt your systems and data. It could look to harvest credentials, so that the attack can come in a later date. It could put a keylogger in place, which means that everything you type on your laptop can be collected and sent away. It can do a number of things. And a lot of these links you don't necessarily have to click on anymore. Just by hovering over them, it can actually instigate the malware. So if you're unsure, don't even put your browser on it, because it could be one of the versions of malware that would just engage the code to go do something nefarious on your networks. So this goes back to one of the key things that we have to do, which is train our staff to be aware of phishing, which is getting those emails with those nefarious links on it. How do you identify it? And we see targeted phishing attacks against CEOs and CFOs, to try and get the credentials, to try and breach the mailboxes that then they can use in order to carry out those invoice redirections. We've got a whole load. You'll hear of spear phishing, whale phishing, like watering holes. They're all types of techniques that attackers use to try and get people to click on links. And it's something that the staff have to be aware of and to have to understand what the indicators would look like in order to help protect the organization.
Another example of those sorts of compromises is that criminals will attack the HR department. They'll send them CVs because the HR department may manage onboarding and offboarding of new staff and old staff. They might be sending CVs through saying, I am legitimately applying for this position. Here's my CV. It's in HR's best interest to open those attachments and say, yes, this person is qualified for this role. Let's interview them. A criminal may create an attachment that looks legitimate but has that embedded code in it, which unfortunately becomes really challenging. That's a really daunting position for HR to be in, because how do you train for this? This is a legitimate looking communication. They are sending out requests for CVs to fill roles. How do you manage that? So there is absolutely the human element and there's absolutely the technology element that need to be considered.
Great advice. Thanks so much. Some of our businesses are larger businesses. Some of them are early in their journey. This is for the smaller businesses more so. What's the most economic and reliable option for a small or starting business?
Yeah, I think it's using a managed service provider that's tailored for the size of your business. You don't really want to be, if you don't have the expertise in-house to set up your own IT shop, then don't. That's not economical. But using a managed service provider that can start up the basic services, and then as you grow, you can change providers as you go from small to medium to a large business. But just don't try to do everything yourself. Don't try to think that just by setting up, your own IT, that you're going to be able to manage all of the risk, because you won't have. If you're an early startup, you're not going to have the finances in place or the resources in place to actually securely provide IT services to yourself. So go to the people who are experts in it, and get them to manage it for you until you outgrow it.
Brilliant.
I add that to that maybe from the insurance side. So insurance is a tool. It's a risk management tool that you should have in consideration as part of your total approach to risk management. But if you are indeed considering insurance, I'd be suggesting speaking to one of your insurer partners who offer a lot of preventative services as well. So the more you can borrow from them free of charge, the better. So don't think of the insurance policy as in cyber insurance as a similar, say, public liability insurance, because that's a very static insurance policy. Cyber insurance can be very dynamic and very helpful. We can provide a couple of different solutions to any business. So I would recommend partnering with a firm that provides you with as much intel and assistance as possible.
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well is one of the things you get with cyber insurance is through the policy is access to a panel of experts. So, typically most organizations like ourselves, we would have 80 vendors on the panel that cover everything from incident response to forensics to PR, communications, legal and regulatory action, so that, a small starting business that doesn't have access to those, going through insurance, you're actually, you'll be paying insurance rates for those vendors, which are typically 30% cheaper than commercial rates. So even that alone, if you had an incident, would be a significant saving above and beyond what the insurance would, recuperate you for.
Awesome. Thank you. The next question, this is, I guess, we've talked a lot about how we prevent some of these issues occurring and how people can get ahead of things. But for those of us who have been a little slow to get the protective wear, we don't have a VPN, we haven't done all the multi-factor authentication. What do we do when we get hacked? And what happens if you're potentially bribed with the information?
So I think there's 2 points to that. One is what you can do in terms of preventative action, so an incident response plan, so that you know what you're going to do. You don't want to go in, you don't want to be waiting until you've been hacked, until you try to figure out what you're going to do. You want to know what you're going to do up front, and you want to know who you're going to contact. So, who is your incident response partner? Have you identified one? If not, you're not going to be able to go to open market like at a time when you're having an incident, because everybody's busy at the moment. So you want to find a partner who can provide you the right resources as quickly as possible in order to help manage that risk. But when we're talking about like extortion and bribery, the recommendation is that you use an incident response partner to actually go through the negotiation process and engage with a specialist ransomware negotiator or extortion expert, because one of the mistakes that a lot of organizations make is they try to engage directly with the threat actor and they get flustered. And there are a ton of techniques that the extortion experts use in order to buy yourself a bit of time, understand the extent of the damage, and then actually negotiate down the ransomware. So if you actually decide to pay, you're not going to be paying the $50,000 or the $100,000 they're asking for. You might get to a position where you're paying $15,000 or $20,000. So, first and foremost, find a partner, understand your process, and make sure you practice it.
Yeah, and take advice along the journey as well. I would absolutely be recommending having some legal advice to make sure that you know your legal obligations around managing that event as well.
So this probably sounds, and I'm going to keep asking lots of these silly questions, that they're usually the most useful ones. What is an incident response partner?
So there's probably two ways to look at it. One, through the insurance, your incident response partner would be what the insurers would call a breach coach. And so it's not somebody who, and that's what my firm does, it's what Clyde & Co does, is we'll coordinate all of the work streams. So there's typically about 10 work streams. And what we would do is we'd help you triage the incident. So understand what's going on and understand the people you need to bring in to support and help you. So that's one way to look at it, is that facilitation, the project management, supporting your business through it. And then the second one is probably the technical incident response and forensics. So the people who are actually in your network, try to find what the attackers are doing, try to find what access they've got, and then try to kick them out your network so that you can actually try and identify and understand any scope of damage or any scope of data loss that you might have had.
Unreal. In construction, which is, we've got a lot of our businesses that focus in construction. There's lots of a broad array of different fields. But in construction, common things like Excel spreadsheets are still very common. How would someone ensure that their data integrity when sharing, that they have data integrity when they're sharing sensitive information with business partners without it being corrupted along the way?
Yeah, it's incredibly difficult. There's probably a range of things that organizations need to consider. One of the things we would always recommend when you're using any form of communication is that it be encrypted and that it be protected. So encrypted means the data you send through, whilst it's in transit from one spot to the other spot, it changes. So if I'm sending you hello, someone who intercepts it along the way doesn't read hello, they read something different altogether. And when you get it at your end, automatically it gets decrypted so that you know that it's the same communication. So encryption, I think, is a really important tool to be using full stop for communications. The next thing is then password. So if you are sending a document, an Excel document with a lot of sensitive information in it, it should be password protected, and that password should be shared via an alternative means to the email that you're sending that communication on to your partner. So again, if I'm sending you an email with some sensitive information and it is protected by a password, I would send you via, say, a text message or a separate communication what the password is. I think that that's really important. That can be quite challenging in construction, however, because that may be going from a whole bunch of different partners. So again, that password management becomes really important. Maybe there are some other technical tools that you might use. Maybe you wouldn't use Excel. Maybe you wouldn't use email communications. Maybe there'd be a specific site, separate site that data is stored on. And then I think that that's one means by which you might consider that. And I think just one thing for construction in particular, because we know that there's a lot of, say, fake invoicing that happens in that particular industry. Again, I've said it before, but I think it's really important to focus on this. Multi-factor authentication. If someone sends you a bill or a request for change of bank details, you should not be communicating on them back to that person on the same communication method. You must have an alternative means by which to say, yes, this is a legitimate communication. Similar to what we're talking now, we're talking security of data, security of integrity, security of communications. And increasingly, I mean, this is getting pretty high tech now, but Chris and I are aware AI and other tools are being used to mimic a lot of these communications and make them look very legitimate. So maybe you need to start considering in your communications with these sensitive things, with sensitive partners, maybe you have a hidden code within that communication to say, this is legitimate. Again, it's not hard for me to now jump on and create an AI bot, which looks very similar to Chris here, and have Chris communicate with someone where Chris is obviously not in the room. So having that hidden communication, I think, is going to be probably important. Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, look, I think it's the tools that you use. Maybe Excel's not the best tool because it's very much you send and that you have no control over the document once it's gone. You know, maybe you look at one of the cloud-based, alternatives to Excel, like Sheets or Google Sheets or something like that, because that allows you to see any changes that are made to the document and track those changes as they're being made, which, would be better. But, I get that within the industry that, people are still throwing around spreadsheets, and it would be down to the business process. So if you're sending the spreadsheet with information to your business partner, like before you agree to anything, before anything's validated, making sure that you're both agreeing to the same thing, and that, not all business partners are trustworthy, right? Maybe they want to reduce the cost of an item, and they just try and sneak it into the spreadsheet. So it's getting that validation. It's the business process that's going to support it there. There are tools that you can use in terms of data integrity, but if you're a small business, you're probably not going to want to spend tens of thousands of dollars, just to do that, when it can be as simple as, you get the document back, you confirm it, and then you agree, you continue with the agreement. But I would expect that anything you agree to in a spreadsheet is probably going to move into your contracts. So making sure that, you're explicit in your contracts in terms of what that agreement is. And that probably goes into the following questions around supply chain risk management.
Thank you again. Deadly answers, so much, so many, what I'm probably was surprised at, there's so many different ways that you can build your protection. And I think some of us aren't cognizant of all these different factors lift the standard of protection higher and higher and make it harder. Another question from one of our businesses is, how can we make sure the business partner, and I think this comes back to perhaps some of the things you just touched on, how do we make sure the business partner keeps the information safe and ensure the information is used as intended?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. first and foremost, again, if you look at the contracts, what's that provider, what you expect that provider to do through your contract? Do you have a schedule that talks about privacy, that talks about security, talks about the use of the data? Because one thing that we've seen in the past is you might be giving your data to a third party or a direct partner, but then they might be using it with somebody else and somebody else and somebody else. And so you get this really long chain of your data just goes to places where you never expected it to. Some of the vendors, some of the larger vendors, like so if you went to Amazon or Microsoft or Google and said, hey, what are you doing with our data? Basically, they're going to tell you to poke it. Like, they're not going to give you the time of day. They're going to say, here's a couple of documents that show that we're secure, and off you go. But smaller, mid-sized vendors that you're concerned about, you might have critical data, or they might be processing information on your behalf, absolutely have the right to audit. Make sure that you understand that what they're doing in terms of their controls to protect the data, and go and have a look yourself. Get an auditor to go and have a look. Get somebody to review them, just to give you confidence if it's something that is critical to your business.
Thanks, fellas. Again, more sound advice. This is our final question, and I've found today incredibly enlightening. So I hope all our viewers are getting lots of notes written down. This one came from an actual real life incident. One of our businesses was telling us that their business had been hacked by Russian bots, and the bots used their emails that were provided on their website. They wanted to know what information should they be putting on their website and what information isn't wise to put on their website.
Yeah.
So I think at a high level, you've got to assume anything you put on your website is something that anyone can use either positively or negatively. So with that in mind, I think you should clearly not be putting anything of any sensitivity on there. Unfortunately, email addresses are quite public these days, so putting it on or off your website is probably neither here nor there when it comes down to it, because it's probably compromisable in some other fashion. But having some controls in place to monitor the use of those. So maybe you have a standard email address on a website for communications, and maybe you track and monitor the use of that email as and when. But unfortunately, criminals are pretty good at mimicking these sorts of things. So you've got to assume anything put on your website will be used either positively or negatively. So with that in mind, make sure you're only collecting things that is publicly available. Nothing that should be private at all should be on your website. And another thing to keep in mind is that your website will often feed back into some data banks that you've got sitting somewhere. So having the controls in place, for instance, your membership may be something that you log on to your website, you put in your username and password. You've got to make sure you've got controls in place managing that, and the access that can be created behind that. Something like an SQL injection, a specific attack, may all of a sudden release all of the data that's been saved in that bank and unfortunately compromise the business. And that's a really basic attack that any kid could do. So having your controls in place is important. Anything else to add, Chris?
Yeah, look, I think it's put on your website only things you want people to know that's going to support your business. You don't have to overshare. You don't have to put too many contact details, because the more details you put on there, the more information. So we call it open source intelligence. Like, an attacker will come to your website, they'll look at people's LinkedIn bios, they'll look at people's Facebook bios, they'll create a picture of you, your organization, and you'll use that either to socially engineer or to find ways to think about compromising passwords and access. But one of the things to do, if you have a website and it's an e-commerce website, make sure you're doing the appropriate checking against that to make sure that the web applications are secure and that it can't be easily compromised through one of the top 10 attacks against websites. The other thing you can do is there's a lot of vendors out there that you can engage who will look at open source intelligence for your domain, for your website domain, and they'll be able to come back and say, hey, you've got all of these vulnerabilities and you should consider securing them in these ways. And that's something that we can provide details of some vendors on, or can assist some of your members in order to do that. But understanding your vulnerabilities, understanding what the attackers can see from an external perspective on your websites is critical, because that's the first way in they get. And as Mick said earlier on, a lot of these tools run 24/7, 365. They're just looking for vulnerabilities. And if your website is vulnerable, you're going to get pinged and somebody's going to come and have a look. And if they think it's worth their time, they're going to come after you and they're going to try and compromise you and they're going to try and take your money.
And on that point, I still get every now and again people saying, I'm too small a business. Why would they come after me? The fact of the matter is they're not coming after you. They just find a hole. And a bot automatically says there's a hole here. That's when they start. They go, well, I don't know who this address is. I don't know who it is. So I'll just start investigating. They may turn around and find that there's an easy compromise for them. So yes, they'll exploit it. If it works to be financially in their benefit, they will. Maybe they'll only charge a small ransom for a small entity. Maybe it's a big ransom for a big entity. You don't know. But what you do know is that if you catch them at the wrong time, or if they catch you at the wrong time, and they can find some easy money, they'll pursue it. It's in their endeavors to pursue money.
And not all criminals are Russian mobsters or North Korean gangsters and stuff like that. They are 12-year-old kids. They're enthusiasts who will find something like this and they will try and exploit it because they see it as a learning opportunity. And arguably, those people are more dangerous because they don't actually know what they're doing and they don't know the damage that they can inflict on your business. Whereas when you get the more sophisticated actors, they're typically after a specific thing. They've got a specific intention. And so, we've got examples of serious criminal organizations kicking out other hackers from our clients' businesses because they don't want anybody else in there causing any noise or stopping them from doing what they want to do. So, unsophisticated hackers, very bad for you. The more sophisticated ones, you're going to be targeted, but they're probably not going to do as much damage to your business as the people who have no idea what they're doing.
And fellas, we're just about to wrap up, so I appreciate your time. I just want to ask if there was one takeaway from both of you that you think people should be keeping in their heads. What would you both suggest?
For me, nice and easy, MFA, multi-factor authentication. Have it everywhere, have it tested, have it demanded, have it ubiquitously applied throughout the organization.
And Chris?
Just remember the 7 Ps. Like prior planning and preparation prevents piss poor performance. Get prepared for it, because, unfortunately it happens to a lot of organizations and the preparation is key to how you deal with it. And I think just one more thing that I remembered on top of MIX 3, the privileged access management, the patching, and MFA is encryption of backups. So if you do get hit with a ransomware, what's going to save you is having encrypted backups that you can restore your systems and services from.
Thank you guys both so much. Michael, Chris, Aon, you do a terrific service and we've absolutely appreciated you spending your time with Kinaway today. And to all our business members, you've heard it right here. Lots of great information. You can re-watch this. You can stream it over and over and over to get those details again. By all means, please, business members, get involved and prepare in advance because it's probably going to happen. That sounds like the wisdom we're hearing. Thanks, fellas. Balu.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks.